The sound of rain against the kitchen window had always comforted Grace Miller. It was soft, familiar, a rhythm that filled the quiet spaces of her home. On mornings like this, she would make herself a cup of tea, sit by the window, and watch the world outside blur into gentle shades of silver and green. But lately, the quiet had started to feel heavier. It had been almost 5 years since her husband Daniel passed away. 5 years since laughter had filled the corners of their small house, since a voice other than her own had echoed down the hall. Life had moved on, as everyone said it would. But Grace sometimes wondered if moving on was just another way of learning to live with absence. She had her routines, her garden, her work at the library, her evening walks by the lake. From the outside, she looked like a woman who had made peace with her life. But there was a softness in her eyes, a quiet ache that never quite left. The only person who could still break through that stillness was her son. Ethan, at 20, he was studying architecture in another city, full of ideas and energy that both amazed and intimidated her. When he came home during breaks, the house felt alive again, laughter in the kitchen, music drifting from his room, the smell of coffee and pancakes on lazy mornings. But when he left, the silence always seemed deeper than before. Grace often found herself replaying small moments in her mind. Ethan as a boy, running through the backyard with a paper airplane. Daniel sitting on the porch, watching them with quiet pride. They were memories that glowed softly, like embers that refused to go out. Yet deep down, there was something else Grace never said aloud. A quiet longing, not just for the past, but for a part of herself she had lost along the way. She missed feeling seen. Not as a mother, not as a widow, but simply as a woman with dreams still flickering beneath the surface. She sometimes imagined taking a trip somewhere quiet and green. Maybe the mountains they once talked about visiting as a family. She pictured herself standing at a window of a wooden cabin, breathing in the scent of pine, feeling something like peace. But she never went. Plans like that always seemed to fade under the weight of practicality. Then one afternoon the phone rang. "Hey, Mom." Ethan's voice carried a warmth that instantly brightened her day. "Ethan, it's been weeks since you called," she said, smiling as she stirred her tea. "I know. I'm sorry. Things got busy. But listen, I was thinking, how about we go on a trip? It's just us, like old times." Grace froze, the spoon still in her hand. A trip. Where? "I was thinking the mountains. The same place Dad used to talk about. There's this cabin I found online. Small, quiet, perfect for a weekend. What do you say?" For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. It wasn't the kind of offer she expected from her son, who usually spent vacations with friends or projects. "Ethan, that sounds wonderful," she finally said. "But are you sure? I mean, you don't have to." "I want to, Mom," he interrupted gently. "It's been a while since we just talked. I miss that." Grace felt something stir in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "Let's do it." After the call ended, she sat there for a long time, staring out the window. The rain had stopped, and sunlight began to push through the clouds, spilling across the garden for the first time in a long while. She felt something new, not just hope, but anticipation. That night, she opened the old family photo album, flipping through pages that smelled faintly of dust and time. Pictures of Ethan as a child, Daniel holding him high in the air, the three of them smiling in moments that felt both near and far. She touched one photo, a snapshot of them at the lake. Daniel's arm around her shoulders. The way he had looked at her in that picture still made her heart ache gently. "I hope you're watching." "Daniel," she whispered. "He's grown so much. You'd be proud of him." The next few days moved quietly, but quickly. Grace packed her suitcase carefully, placing the old pendant Daniel had given her years ago on top. She hadn't worn it in ages, but somehow it felt right to bring it. The morning they were to leave, she stood by the door as Ethan pulled up in his car, his smile bright and easy. For a moment, she just looked at him, taller, older, yet still the same boy who used to hold her hand crossing the street. "Ready, Mom?" he said, grabbing her bag. She nodded, her eyes glistening with quiet affection. "More than ready." As they drove away from the city, the world outside shifted, tall buildings fading into fields, then forests, then open sky. Grace watched the road stretch ahead, her reflection flickering. Faintly in the car window, it felt like more than a trip. It felt like a beginning, and somewhere in her heart, a thought whispered, asterisk, maybe this journey will bring back something. I thought I'd lost forever. Asterisk, the road climbed gently through winding hills, each turn revealing a wider sweep of green. Grace watched the trees blur past the car window, their leaves flickering in the sunlight like memories she couldn't quite hold still. Ethan was humming to a song on the radio, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, unaware that his mother's thoughts were drifting somewhere far behind them, not on the road ahead. But in time, it had been years since Grace let herself think about the early days of her marriage. Not because they were painful, but because they were too beautiful. The kind of memories that shine so brightly they almost hurt to touch. She met Daniel when she was 23, on a spring afternoon that smelled of rain and lilacs. He had come into the small bookshop where she worked, looking for a guide on mountain trails. His smile was shy, but his voice carried a warmth that instantly drew her in. I'm not much of a reader, he had admitted, scratching the back of his neck. But I figured if I'm going to get lost out there, I should at least know where I'm going. Grace laughed, a real, unexpected laugh that surprised her as much as him. She helped him find the book, though he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions that had little to do with maps or hiking. When he left, he promised to return the next day to thank her properly. He did, with coffee and a quiet conversation that lasted until closing time. Their connection was never rushed. It unfolded gently, like dawn stretching over the horizon, soft, certain, inevitable. They talked about everything: the books she loved, the trails he wanted to hike, the future they both hoped to build. Grace still remembered their first trip together. A small cabin near a lake surrounded by evergreens. Daniel had packed the car with more snacks than they could ever eat. They spent the days walking along the shore and the nights by a small fire, telling stories and dreaming out loud. She remembered the way he looked at her then, not with intensity, but with quiet understanding, as though he could see every thought she tried to hide and loved her more for it. Years later, when Ethan was born, that look never faded. Daniel would hold their son and whisper, "He has your eyes, Grace," and she would smile, knowing that in those eyes lived every hope they'd ever shared. Now, as the car curved along the mountain road, the echo of Daniel's laughter seemed to follow them, faint but steady, like the hum of a familiar song. Ethan glanced over at her. "You're quiet, thinking about something." She smiled gently. "Just the past. Your father. He loved the mountains." "I know," Ethan said softly. "He used to tell me stories about them. Said they made him feel small in a good way." Grace nodded. "He always said peace isn't something you find. It's something that finds you when you stop searching so hard." Ethan smiled. "That sounds like him." For a moment, silence filled the car. Not empty, but peaceful. Grace realized that in all her quiet years, she hadn't lost Daniel completely. He lived on not only in memories, but in the way Ethan smiled, in the way he cared, in the steady calm he carried. As they reached the cabin, the scent of pine and damp earth wrapped around them. It looked much like the one from long ago: wooden walls, a stone chimney, the distant shimmer of a lake below. Inside, Grace ran her hand along the rough wooden table, the texture grounding her in the present even as it pulled her deeper into the past. She could almost see her younger self there, laughing, as Daniel tried to light a fire, pretending to know what he was doing. She could almost hear their voices overlapping, blending with the rustle of trees outside. But life, she knew, had its own rhythm. There had been years of laughter, of small joys and daily routines, and then one winter morning everything had changed. Daniel's illness had arrived quietly, without warning. Grace never liked to think of the months that followed. They were a blur of hospitals and hope of holding on and letting go. When it was over, she had promised herself she'd stay strong for Ethan. She did. But part of her spirit had settled into silence, A silence so deep it sometimes felt like a room she could not leave. Now, standing in this cabin surrounded by pine and wind, she felt the faintest door open inside her. That evening, Ethan built a small fire while Grace unpacked. The orange light flickered against the walls, painting the room in warmth. She sat near the window, watching dusk settle over the forest. Ethan handed her a cup of cocoa, just the way Daniel used to make it, with a pinch of cinnamon. I remembered, he said with a small grin. Grace took it, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and nostalgia. You did, she whispered. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, sounding almost like a voice carried on the breeze. Gentle, familiar, kind. Grace closed her eyes and listened. It didn't feel like sadness anymore. It felt like remembering, like rediscovering a song she once loved and realizing she still knew every word. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her memories. The past hadn't vanished. It had only been waiting quietly, patiently for her to return and listen once more. And somewhere deep in her heart, she sensed that this trip, this small journey through time and place, was leading her toward something she wasn't ready to name yet, but could already feel morning sunlight filtered through the cabin's thin curtains, painting soft lines across the wooden floor. Grace stirred awake to the faint sound of birds and the smell of something cooking. For a moment, she didn't move, just listened. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm when she stepped into the kitchen. She found Ethan standing by the stove, humming the same tune Daniel used to hum on Sunday mornings. The sound reached her like an echo from another time. "You're up early," she said with a smile. Ethan turned, flipping a pancake with exaggerated confidence. "I thought I'd surprise you. Breakfast, Mountain Edition." Grace laughed softly. "That's brave. You remember the last time you tried to cook?" He grinned. "You mean when I nearly set off the smoke alarm?" "Yeah, I've grown since then." She poured herself some coffee, watching him work. There was something in his movements, careful, deliberate, that reminded her of Daniel. The resemblance wasn't just in looks. It was in spirit. For a while, they ate in easy silence. The kind of silence that didn't need filling. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches catching the light. After breakfast, Ethan suggested they take a walk down to the lake. The path wound between tall pines, their needles carpeting the ground in soft green. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and cedar. Grace walked slowly, taking in the world around her, the sound of water, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sunlight flickering between branches. It was almost the same trail she and Daniel had walked years ago, though time had softened its edges. As they neared the lake, she noticed a man standing by the water's edge, holding a fishing rod. His posture was relaxed, but there was something familiar in the way he stood. That quiet patience she'd only ever seen in one person. When he turned, Grace froze. "Michael." He looked up, surprised, then smiled. Grace Miller." Ethan glanced between them, puzzled. "You know him?" Grace nodded, her voice faint. "Yes, we used to work together. A long time ago." Michael Fisher. The name returned with 100 small memories attached. Laughter over morning coffee at the library. Shared glances when they both reached for the same book. Gentle conversations that had once filled the spaces Daniel's illness left behind. They had grown close in those days. Not out of romance, but from understanding. He had lost someone to his sister, and grief had become their shared language. But life, as it often does, had pulled them in different directions. He moved away for a new job. She stayed, choosing stability over change. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. Now, here he was, standing beside the same lake that once framed her happiest memories. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, still half in disbelief. "Neither did I," he replied, smiling softly. "My brother owns a cabin nearby. I come here to fish when I need a little quiet. And you?" "A trip with my son," she said, glancing at Ethan. "He planned the whole thing." Michael's eyes warmed. "Then he has good instincts. This place still has magic in it." Ethan soon wandered off down the trail, camera in hand, leaving them by the water. The air between Grace and Michael felt both familiar and new, like returning to a place you thought you'd forgotten but still knew by heart. They talked for a long time about work, about life, about the small ways time had changed them. Michael told her he still volunteered at the local community center, still read the same authors she had once recommended. Grace laughed when he confessed he never returned her copy of The Secret Garden. "After all these years, you still have it?" she asked. He smiled, eyes bright with nostalgia. "Some things are worth keeping." The words hung gently between them, not heavy, just true. Grace felt a warmth rise in her chest, not the fire of lost love, but the quiet recognition of something human and kind that had once brought her comfort. The sun began to lower, casting gold across the lake. Ethan's voice called from a distance, and Grace turned toward it, her heart full of a strange, peaceful ache. Michael picked up his fishing rod. "It was good seeing you again, Grace. Really good." She hesitated, then smiled. "You too, Michael? Take care of yourself." He nodded. "I will, and Grace." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You look happier than the last time I saw you." "That's good to see." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said softly. As she and Ethan walked back to the cabin, the path seemed different, brighter somehow. Ethan talked about the photos he'd taken, the reflections on the lake, the way the light caught the trees. Grace listened, but her thoughts drifted between past and present, between what was and what still could be. That night, as she sat by the fire, she thought about Michael, not with longing, but with gratitude. Their meeting had reminded her of something she hadn't realized she'd lost, the ability to feel warmth without fear, to remember without pain. She looked at Ethan, who was sketching by the firelight, his face calm and focused. He looked so much like Daniel in that moment that her heart swelled. Grace smiled quietly to herself. Sometimes she realized life brings people and memories back to you, not to change your path, but to remind you how far you've come. And in that small, flickering light, surrounded by everything she still had, she felt it, not the ache of the past, but the peace of the present. The morning air was cool and still, the kind that makes every sound feel clearer. Grace woke early, long before Ethan stirred. The cabin was wrapped in a hush so complete that even the ticking of the old wall clock seemed softer than usual. She stood by the window, watching mist curl between the trees. It was their last day in the mountains. Part of her felt ready to go home, but another part, the quieter, deeper part, didn't want to leave yet. Something inside her whispered that there was still one moment left, one truth waiting to be spoken. When Ethan finally woke, he joined her at the window, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early again," he said with a yawn. Grace smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep. The forest feels different this morning." He nodded, looking out into the fog. "Yeah, it does." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the kind that had always existed between them, gentle, unhurried. But Grace noticed the way Ethan kept glancing at her as if weighing whether to say something. Finally, he took a breath. "Mom, can we go somewhere? There's a place I want to show you before we leave." She agreed, curious, and soon they were walking through the trees again, following a path that wound upward through tall grass and morning light. The air smelled of pine and dew. Ethan led the way until they reached a small clearing overlooking the valley below. There, at the center, stood a simple wooden bench, old, weathered, and facing east where the sun had begun to rise. Grace stopped. "This place," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Ethan nodded. "Dad used to bring me here when I was little." She turned to him, surprised. "He did." "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice steady but quiet. "After you'd go to work, sometimes he'd take me hiking. We'd sit here for hours. He told me this was his thinking spot. Said he came here whenever he needed to remember what really mattered." Grace felt her throat tighten. "He never told me about this place. Think he wanted to keep it special," Ethan said. "But before he got sick, he asked me to promise something. He said that when the time was right, I'd bring you here." Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "He did. Ethan nodded again, then reached into his backpack and, "He asked me to give you this." He handed her a small envelope worn at the edges. Grace hesitated before opening it. Inside was a folded letter written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. Asterisk, my dearest Grace. Greater than if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say everything I wanted. You've always been my home, Grace, my calm in every storm. I don't want you to spend your life holding on to what's gone. I want you to keep living, to find peace, to laugh again. Take Ethan to the mountains. They'll remind you that even after winter, spring always finds its way back, greater than. And when you sit on this bench, remember, love doesn't end. It just changes shape. Greater than yours always. Daniel, asterisk, Grace, pressed the letter to her chest, her tears falling quietly. For so long she had carried her grief like something she had to protect, afraid that letting go meant forgetting. But Daniel's words felt like sunlight breaking through the fog, gentle, warm, and forgiving. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. I wanted to tell you earlier, but I thought you should read it here, where he meant for you too. She turned to him, her voice trembling. You planned this whole trip. Because of him? He smiled. Yeah, I found the letter a few months ago in one of Dad's old journals. I thought maybe it was time we both came back here, not to be sad, but to remember him, right? Grace looked at her son, her heart full in a way she couldn't name. You've grown into someone your father would be proud of. Ethan smiled softly. I learned from you both. They sat on the bench together, the valley stretching before them, the air filled with birdsong. The sun rose higher, painting the mist in gold. Grace read the letter again, this time not with tears, but with gratitude. I think I understand now, she said quietly. Love doesn't disappear when someone's gone. It just finds new places to live. Ethan nodded. Maybe that's why we came here, to find it again. For a long while, they sat in silence. The world below moved on, trees swaying, light shifting. Life continuing, and Grace felt the same happening inside her. When they finally stood to leave, she took one last look at the view. Goodbye, Daniel, she whispered. But it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like peace. On the drive back, the sky cleared completely. And Grace found herself smiling at the simple beauty of the road ahead. Bright, endless, alive. Ethan glanced at her and smiled too, as if he could sense the quiet change in her heart. That night, back home, Grace placed Daniel's letter in a small frame beside their family photo. The pendant Ethan had given her rested around her neck. Catching the evening light, she sat by the window, her favorite spot, and for the first time in years, the silence felt different. Not empty, just still. A memory passed through her mind. Daniel's laughter. The warmth of his hand. The sound of Ethan's voice calling her mom when he was small. Each one felt alive again. Not as reminders of loss, but as proof of love that never faded. Grace closed her eyes and whispered to herself, this is what he meant. Love changes shape, but it never leaves. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it a sense of something lasting, not past, not gone, just transformed. And in that soft, golden moment, Grace finally understood what it meant to heal.